The morning I decided to plant the south slope was a Tuesday in late July of 1993. I remember the air was so thick you could taste the dust from the county road a mile away, and the heat hadn't broken from the day before. It was the kind of morning that promises a long, hard afternoon. The kind where the cicadas are already buzzing by 6 a.m., and the metal on the barn door is warm to the touch before the sun is fully over the tree line. Every other field in the county that was going to be corn was already shoulder-high, dark green and rustling, with a dry sound that was half growth and half thirst. The planting window for field corn had closed 6 weeks prior, and for sweet corn, most folks figured you had until the end of June at the absolute latest if you didn't want to be feeding frosted stalks to the cows. I was out there not with a combine or a haybine, but with the old 2-row planter, the one my father bought used in 1967, the one with the seed plates I still had to change by hand with a wrench. I'd spent the day before greasing the chains and checking the depth gauge, the smell of old oil and settled dust filling the machine shed. I was hitching it to the 4020, the tractor that had already done its share of work for the season and was supposed to be enjoying a quiet summer. It felt like asking an old man to run a foot race after he'd already finished his day's chores. The ground on that slope was tilled and ready. It was an 8-acre piece, a gentle curve facing due south that fell away toward the creek bottom. We'd always used it for pasture or hay because it was too steep for the big modern equipment to work comfortably. It was inconvenient ground. That was the word the cooperative used for it. Too small to bother with, too tilted to be efficient. I had turned it over a week before, and the soil was black, and holding moisture surprisingly well cool under the top 2 inches of sun-baked crust. As I was making my first pass, laying down a ruler straight line of what I hoped would be promise, my neighbor's truck pulled up along the fence line. It was a new Ford, the color of a summer sky, and just as clean a truck that mostly hauled groceries and opinions. He rolled down the passenger window, the electric motor, making a soft whirring sound that seemed out of place against the chug of my old tractor. He cut his engine but left the radio on. Low murmur of talk radio I couldn't quite make out. He leaned across the seat, resting his arm on the door frame. He didn't wave, just watched me finish the row, turn the rig around, and start back the other way. I throttled down and pulled up near the fence. Old machines, like old men, don't always like to start again once they've been stopped. Morning, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact with a little bit of confusion stirred in. I nodded back. Morning. He looked at the planter, then at the turned soil, then back at me. A slow smile crept onto his face, the kind a man gets when he thinks he's in on a joke, but isn't quite sure what the punchline is yet. Putting in a late garden, he asked. The emphasis was on the word late. I knew what he was asking. He was asking if I'd lost my mind. 8 acres isn't a garden. It's a field. And planting it with sweet corn at the end of July wasn't just late. It was, by every conventional measure, foolish. Something like that, I said. I could feel the heat radiating off the tractor's engine block, shimmering the air between us. Sweet corn, I added, because there was no sense in hiding it. His smile broadened, but the humor left his eyes. Now, it was just polite concern. The kind of look you give a man you think is about to make a terrible and very public mistake. "Sweet corn," he repeated slow. "You're a good month, maybe 6 weeks past prime on that. Frost will take it before it even thinks about tasseling." He wasn't being cruel. He was stating a fact as he knew it. He was quoting the common wisdom, the almanac, the university extension bulletins, the shared knowledge of every farmer in a 100-mile radius. He was telling me that water runs downhill and the sun sets in the west. He was telling me something I already knew. I just nodded again. "I'm counting on a mild fall." It was a weak answer, and we both knew it. Mild falls were a hope, not a strategy. Farming is a business of managing risk, and what I was doing looked from his clean truck like I was betting the farm on a single spin of the roulette wheel. He shook his head. A small, slow motion. "It's your fuel." He put the truck in gear. "You need a hand. Come October plowing under the frozen stalks. You let me know." And with that, he drove off, leaving a small cloud of dust to settle on the fence posts. By noon, I knew the diner would have a version of the story, and by the time the coffee was cold, the version would have grown. I wasn't just planting corn late. I was planting it because I'd forgotten to do it in the spring, or because I'd had a fight with my wife, or because I was trying some new government program for failed farms. The truth was, I hadn't forgotten a thing. I was planting those 8 acres on that specific slope, on that specific day, because of a line of pencil written in a faded notebook 30 years before. I was betting on a ghost and on a patch of ground that I believed knew something the rest of the county had forgotten. The calendar tells you the rule. My father had said that 100 times. But the ground, he'd always add, the ground tells you the exception. I was out there in the July heat, listening for an exception. The extension agent showed up 2 days later. He was a young man, barely 25, with a fresh degree and a clipboard full of charts and data. His shirt was a crisp khaki, with the university logo embroidered on the pocket, and his boots looked like they'd been purchased the week before. He was earnest and well-meaning, and he was absolutely certain about everything. He'd heard about my project at the Coop. He said someone had mentioned it, and he thought he'd just stop by and offer his services, which was a polite way of saying he'd come to tell me to stop before I wasted any more time and money. We stood at the edge of the newly planted field, the soil now a uniform dark brown, after a brief overnight shower. The first signs of germination were still a day or two away. He took a soil sample, more out of habit than necessity, and then he flipped to a page on his clipboard. "So," he began, clicking his ballpoint pen. "You're looking at a 95-day variety here, I assume, one of the faster ones." I told him it was an old, open-pollinated variety, closer to 100 days, a variety my father had favored, called Silver Queen, though this was a strain we'd saved ourselves for years. His pen stopped. He looked up from his clipboard, his expression a perfect blend of academic curiosity and pity. 100 days, he said, as if I'd told him I was trying to grow pineapples. "So planting the 28th of July, 100 days puts you at the 5th of November for full maturity." He underlined the date twice, the average first frost date for this county, based on the last 30 years of NOAA data. The earliest first frost on record was the 22nd of September. "You see the problem," He wasn't asking, he was teaching. He then launched into a detailed explanation of growing degree days, or GDDs. He explained how corn needs a certain accumulation of heat units to move from one stage of growth to the next, from germination to tasseling to maturity. He showed me the average GDD accumulation for our region. According to his data, we would run out of heat right around the time the ears were just beginning to fill. Sometime in mid-October, the plant would shut down. The kernels would be small, starchy. Best case scenario, he concluded, clicking his pen again, you get a few underdeveloped ears. Worst case, and I have to be honest, the statistically probable case, is a total loss. A 92% chance of crop failure, to be precise. He said it with the quiet confidence of a man who trusts numbers above all else. He believed in the data. The data was clean, predictable, and universal. My field was just one data point, and it was trending toward failure. I listened politely. I thanked him for his time, for the information. I told him I appreciated the university's work. He seemed pleased by that, and a little relieved. So you'll maybe rethink the plan, he asked hopefully. Maybe put it back into a cover crop for the fall? No, I said. I think I'll let it grow. The hope in his eyes vanished. He just nodded, put his clipboard back in his truck. If you change your mind, he said, or if you want to talk about options for managing the crop residue after it freezes. He drove away, and I was left there with his 92% certainty hanging in the air. I knew he was right. By the book. I knew my neighbor was right. By experience. I knew the whole town was right. By common sense. But I kept going back to those afternoons as a boy, sitting on the porch with my father watching that south slope. He never said much about it, but he watched it. He watched it in the spring, noting how the snow was gone from its face a full week before it melted off the flat fields. He'd just point with his chin and say, "Look at that," anxious to get to work. He watched it in the fall, how the colors of the hardwoods that bordered it on the west and north seemed to hold on longer, a final blaze of red and orange when the other trees were already bare. And he especially watched the fog on cool mornings. The creek at the bottom of the slope would generate a thick, white blanket of it, but it rarely crept more than a few feet up the hillside. The slope itself would be sitting in clear, cool sunshine, while the entire valley was still asleep under a layer of white. "Sits high and dry," he'd murmur. He wasn't talking about water. He was talking about the cold. He had a way of seeing the land, not as a single uniform thing, but as a collection of smaller pieces, each with its own personality, its own habits. He believed a farm wasn't one big field but 100 little ones, and a good farmer knew the moods of every single one. That's why he said it over and over, until it was carved into my own way of thinking. The calendar tells you the rule. The ground tells you the exception. The young man from the university had the calendar, he had the rules. Printed out and averaged over 30 years. He had the 92%. What I had was the memory of a man watching a hill, and a feeling that this particular piece of ground was an exception. I hadn't looked at my father's notebooks in years, not since he passed. They were in a small wooden crate on a shelf in the back of the machine shed, tucked behind spare filters and boxes of old bolts. My mother had saved them. She said they were his real diary. The story of his life told in bushels per acre and rainfall totals. I'll own that I had put off going through them. It felt too final, like closing a door I wasn't ready to close. But after the extension agent left, I knew it was time. I was no longer just curious. I was committed. I was risking 8 acres of seed, fuel, and time, not to mention a whole season of quiet mockery from my neighbors. I needed to know if I was chasing a memory or a fact. That evening, after the chores were done and the sun had settled below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple, I went out to the machine shed. I turned on the single bare bulb that hung from a cord over the main workbench. The light was yellow and weak, casting long shadows that made the familiar shapes of tools and equipment seem strange and ancient. I found the crate right where I remembered it. It was made of old pine, the wood gray and soft with age. Inside were 24 or so notebooks. They were small, pocket-sized ledgers, the kind you could get at the feed store for a quarter. Their covers were marbled black and white, now softened and curled at the edges. Some were stained with grease, others with what looked like coffee. I picked one up. It was from 1968. The year was written on the cover in my father's careful angular script, a penmanship that was as practical and unadorned as the man himself. I blew a fine layer of dust off the cover and opened it. The pages were filled with his daily notes. The ink was a faded blue-black, the pencil entries gone soft and gray. It smelled of old paper and engine oil and the dry, clean scent of a place. I sat on an overturned bucket, the notebook open in my hands under the single bulb. It was like listening to him talk. The entries were short, terse. The 12th of April. Rain overnight, 0.6 inches. Too wet to work the north. 40. Mended fence by the creek. May 5. Planted soybeans. Soil temp 58 degrees. Wind out of the northwest steady. The 20th of July. Second cutting of hay is light. Needs rain. He recorded commodity prices, the cost of a new set of tires for the tractor, the day a new calf was born. It was the simple, unglamorous accounting of a farmer's life. It was a record of work, of weather, of worry, and of small, quiet victories. I paged through the summer, past the notes on spraying for corn borers and the long, dry spell in August. I was looking for something specific, a mention of that south slope. I didn't even know if I would find it. It was just a hunch, a hope that his quiet observations had made it onto the page. I found it in late September. The entry was dated the 28th of September, 1968. The first part was standard. Light frost this morning, 31 degrees at the house. Tomato plants are done. But then, below that was a second, more detailed note. It was written with a sharper pencil, as if he'd gone back to add it later in the day. After thinking on it. Checked the south slope pasture, he wrote. No frost sign above the first 20 feet. Ground still warm to the touch. The fog settled in the bottom like it always does. And then came the line. It was underlined, not once, but twice, a single cryptic sentence followed by a question mark, as if he was asking the question of himself, or of the future. That south slope holds the days, he check fog line, never freezes first. That was it. That was the ghost I was chasing. It wasn't just a vague memory of him watching a hill, it was a documented observation, a hypothesis. He had seen it, noted it, questioned it. He had noticed the thermal belt, the microclimate created by the slope's orientation to the sun. and its elevation above the cold air that pooled in the creek bottom. The sun hits a south-facing slope at a more direct angle for more hours of the day, especially in the spring and fall when the sun is lower in the ski. The soil absorbs that energy, that heat, all day long. Then at night, as the surrounding air cools, the slope radiates that stored heat back out, creating a bubble of slightly warmer air around it. Cold air is denser than warm air, so it sinks. On a calm, clear night, the coldest air in a valley will drain downhill and pool in the lowest areas, right where the fog forms. My father had seen the result, a hillside that was naturally protected from the first light frosts of the season. He'd written it down, a gift, left for whoever came after him, a piece of knowledge that no university chart of regional averages would ever capture. The question mark at the end told me everything. He had seen the phenomenon, but he had never tested it. He had used the field for hay, for pasture. He had never taken the risk of planting a late crop there, to see if his theory was correct. He had observed the exception, but he had never built a plan around it. Closed the notebook and sat there for a long time in the quiet of the machine shed, the smell of dust and old iron all around me. The 92% chance of failure didn't seem so certain anymore. The young man with the clipboard had the data for the county. My father had the data for that specific 8 acres. I decided, sitting there on that overturned bucket, that I was going to trust my father's data. The next morning, I was out before the sun was up, walking the newly planted field. I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just farming anymore. It was an experiment. It was a conversation with my father across 30 years. I was determined to see it through. The first part of the experiment was confirming what my father had suspected. A memory and a line in a notebook were a start. But I needed my own numbers. I wasn't going to rely on faith alone. Farming teaches you to trust, but it also teaches you to verify. So I started my own slow investigation. I bought 2 soil thermometers, the kind with a long metal probe and a simple dial on top. One I placed in the middle of the south slope about halfway up. The other I placed in the flat field just north of it, the one that was planted with soybeans and represented the normal conditions for my farm. For the next 2 weeks, I became a student of my own land. Every morning at sunrise, before the sun had a chance to start warming the ground, I would go out and take the readings. I wrote them down in a new notebook, a clean one. The flat field would read, on average, around 68 degrees. The south slope, even at that early hour, was consistently 71, sometimes 72 degrees. It had held on to the heat from the day before, a slow, steady release of warmth that kept the soil from chilling too deeply overnight. Then I'd go back at noon, at the peak of the sun's strength. The flat field would be around 80 degrees at a 4-inch depth. The south slope, angled perfectly to catch the full force of the midday sun, would be pushing 86 or 87. The most important reading, though, was the one I took at dusk, just as the light was fading. The flat field would have already started to cool, dropping a few degrees. But the south slope would still be radiating warmth, often just as hot as it had been at noon. It was a thermal battery, and it was charging all day and discharging all night. The difference was small, just a few degrees. But in farming, a few degrees is everything. It's the difference between germination and rot, between growth and stagnation, between a harvest and a loss. The corn sprouted in 5 days. It came up clean and even, a series of bright green shoots pushing through the black soil in perfectly straight rows. The extra warmth in the soil had given it a fast, strong start. The young extension agent had told me to expect germination in 7 to 10 days. I was already 2 days ahead of schedule. As the corn grew through August, I continued to watch the fog. On those cool, still mornings, it was just as my father had described. A thick, solid sea of white would fill the creek bottom, its surface flat and level as a tabletop. And my field of young corn would be sitting above it, an island of green in a world of white. The fog line was sharp, cutting across the base of the slope about 20 feet up from the bottom. Below that line, the corn was damp, covered in a fine mist. Above it, the stalks were dry and catching the first rays of sunlight. My father's note had been precise: check fog line. He knew that where the fog sat was where the coldest air was pooling. I was seeing the proof of his theory every other morning. The work itself was simple. I cultivated the corn twice with the old tractor to keep the weeds down. The rows were spaced for the old equipment a little wider than modern standards, which gave each stalk more room to breathe and gather sunlight. August turned hot and dry, the sky a pale, hazy blue for weeks on end. The soybeans in the flat fields started to show stress, their leaves curling in the afternoon heat. I had to irrigate the corn once, pumping water from the farm pond. It was a full day's work, moving the big sprinkler pipe by hand, section by section, but the corn responded immediately. The stalks, which had been a healthy dark green, deepened to an almost blue-green color overnight, and they seemed to grow 2 inches by the next morning. My neighbor would drive by every few days. He never stopped again, but he'd slow down, his new truck kicking up a little less dust. I could see him looking at the field, at the even stand, at the healthy color. He never waved, just kept his eyes on the corn, a look of quiet professional curiosity on his face. He was a good farmer, and he couldn't ignore good-looking corn, no matter how impossible its timing seemed. By the first week of September, the corn was waist-high and growing fast. It was catching up. The extra heat from the slope was shaving days off its growth cycle, pushing it toward maturity faster than the charts and the averages would have predicted. I started to feel a cautious optimism. The experiment was working. But the real test was still to come. The calendar pages were turning, and every day brought us closer to the one thing that all the soil warmth in the world couldn't stop: the first killing frost. The local radio stations started their evening farm report with chatter about it. A cold front was building in Canada, a mass of Arctic air pushing south. They were predicting a clear, calm night in the next week or so. The perfect conditions for a radiation frost, where the ground loses its heat to the clear night sky and the temperature plummets in the hours just before dawn. I started checking the forecast 3 times a day. I'd walk the field in the evenings, feeling the air, watching the sky. The corn had tasseled, a beautiful pale gold against the deep green of the leaves. The first silks were emerging from the tips of the young ears. It was the most vulnerable stage. A frost now would kill the silks, prevent pollination, and leave me with 8 acres of barren stalks. It was a race, a silent, slow-motion race between my corn and the coming cold. And all I could do was watch and wait, and trust in a dead man's wisdom. The corn grew through September, each day a small victory against the calendar. The ears began to fill, the silks turning from a pale blonde to a dry chocolate brown, a sign that pollination was complete. The stalks were well over 6 feet tall now, a dense dark green forest on that south-facing slope. From the road it looked like a miracle, a patch of high summer thriving in the golden light of early autumn. The soybeans in the other fields had all turned yellow and were beginning to drop their leaves. Combines were starting to roll across the county, leaving behind dusty, barren fields. My little patch of green was an anomaly, a stubborn refusal to accept that the season was over. The talk at the diner I heard had shifted. It was no longer about my foolishness now, it was a kind of spectator sport. The question was, would I beat the frost? Bets were being made over cups of coffee. Most of the money was still on the frost. Experience is a hard thing to bet against. On the last day of September, the weather forecast turned serious. The cold front we'd been hearing about had finally pushed across the border. The weatherman on the evening news stood in front of a map that showed a huge, swirling mass of blue descending upon us. He used words like unseasonably cold and record-breaking. He predicted a low of 28 degrees. It was still 2 weeks before the average first frost date. The university's 30-year average was about to be broken. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee. By midnight, it was 40 degrees. The sky was perfectly clear, filled with a billion cold, distant stars. There was no wind, not even a breeze. The perfect, terrible conditions for a hard frost. I wondered if he had ever felt this way, sitting up at night, his entire season's work resting on the whim of the weather. I wondered if he had ever wanted to try this experiment himself but had lost his nerve. Or maybe he just never had the right combination of a dry year and an open field to make it worth the risk. Sometime before dawn, I put on a heavy coat and walked out to the field. The ground was hard under my boots. As I got closer to the creek bottom, I could see it. The low-lying pasture was covered in a thick, white carpet of frost. It clung to every blade of grass, sparkling in the faint pre-dawn light. The air smelled of cold, clean ice. My heart sank. 28 degrees was colder than a light frost. It was a killer. I walked up the slope into the corn. I braced myself for what I would find. Wilted, blackened leaves, frozen ears, a total loss. But, as I climbed, the air changed. It was still cold, but it lost that sharp, biting edge. It was a subtle shift, maybe only a degree or two, but it was there. I reached the first row of corn, where the stalks stood above the frost line I had seen so many times with the fog. I pulled out a flashlight and aimed its beam at a leaf. It was green. It was supple. There was no ice on it. I walked deeper into the field, moving up the slope. Every stalk was the same. The leaves were untouched. The ears hung heavy and full, their husks a healthy living green. The ground beneath my feet felt different too. It wasn't frozen solid. It had a slight give to it. It had held the day's heat, just as my father had said it would. It had breathed out that warmth all night, fighting back against the cold, creating a fragile, invisible shield that had saved my crop. I stood in the middle of the field until the sun came up, a red ball on the horizon. The first rays of light hit the frosted valley, and the ice began to melt and steam. But my corn, My impossible corn stood tall and green in the morning sun, untouched. It was to a man named Arthur Jenkins, a man I hadn't spoken to in years but whose name was legendary among produce growers. He was the primary buyer for the concession stands at the State Fair, which was due to open in 10 days. He was an old-timer, a man who had been buying produce since before I was born. He didn't care about university studies or planting dates. He cared about one thing. I told him I had 8 acres of sweet corn, Silver Queen, that would be ready in about a week. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sweet corn," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Son, the frost killed everything. My regular guys, their patches are black. There isn't a fresh ear of local sweet corn to be had in this state." "I have it," I said. "The frost didn't touch it." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be there this afternoon," he said, and hung up. He arrived around 3 o'clock in an old, dusty pickup truck that had earned its every dent. He was a small, wiry man in his late 70s, with hands like gnarled oak roots and eyes that had seen 1,000 fields. He didn't say much. He just walked out to the field with me. He went deep into the rows far from the road, where the corn was thickest. He walked slowly, looking at the height of the stalks, the color of the leaves, the size of the ears. He pulled an ear from a stalk, tore off the husk with an expert twist of his wrist, and exposed the kernels. They were perfect. Small, pearly white, and packed tight in straight, uniform rows. He pressed his thumbnail into a kernel, and a milky liquid squirted out the sign of peak ripeness. He was silent for what felt like a long time. He just stood there, holding the ear of corn, looking out over the field. He turned the ear over and over in his hands. He wasn't just looking at a crop, he was judging it, evaluating it, respecting it. Finally, he looked at me. He didn't smile, he just nodded his head once, a short, sharp gesture of approval. "Substantial," he said. It was the only word he used, but coming from him, it was the highest praise. "I'll take every ear you can pick," he said. "The fair starts next Friday. You have them there by Thursday." The next few days were a blur of work. I hired a couple of high school kids from the next farm over, and we picked from sunup to sundown. The ears were heavy and perfect, the yield far better than I had dared to hope. We filled bin after bin with fresh-picked sweet corn, the smell of it sweet and green in the cool autumn air. We loaded it onto an old flatbed truck, carefully stacking the crates to keep the ears from being bruised. It was a mountain of corn, a testament to a small patch of ground that broke all the rules. On Wednesday, the day before I was due to drive the corn to the state fairgrounds, my neighbor drove up again. It was late in the afternoon and we were loading the last of the crates. He pulled his clean Ford up to the edge of the field and got out this time. He didn't stay by his truck but walked right over to where we were working. He was wearing his usual clean jeans and a fresh shirt, but he didn't seem to mind the dust we were kicking up. He stopped and watched us for a minute, his eyes on the piles of corn. He looked at the green, healthy stalks still standing in the field, then at the crates stacked high on the truck. He walked over to a crate and picked up an ear. He shucked it, just as Arthur Jenkins had done, and looked at the kernels. He ran his thumb over them. He was quiet for a long time. I stopped working and waited for him to say something. I expected him to ask how I'd done it. I expected him to tell me I'd never be able to do it again. But he didn't say any of that. He just stood there, holding the ear of corn, the evidence in his hands. He finally turned to me, his face unreadable. He looked me in the eye. "Well," he said, his voice flat and even. "Looks like your calendar was wrong." He tossed the ear of corn back into the crate, gave a single small nod, and walked back to his truck. He got in, started the engine, and drove away without another word. And in that moment I understood. That was his concession. It was his apology, his tip of the cap, his admission that he'd been wrong. It was delivered without fanfare, without ego, just a simple statement of fact. And it meant more to me than any grand gesture could have. It was the quiet acknowledgement of one farmer to another that something remarkable had happened here. It wasn't about being right and him being wrong. It was about respect. The respect a man earns when he pays attention, when he listens to the land, and when he's willing to take a risk on something that only he can see. I delivered the corn the next day. Arthur Jenkins was there to meet me. He paid me a price that was nearly 3 times the normal market rate. He said the first vendors had already started calling, desperate for local produce. After the frost, my corn was the only game in town. For the 10 days of the state fair, anyone who bought a roasted ear of corn was eating my corn. They were eating the product of a south-facing slope, of a father's careful observation, of a single line written in a dusty notebook. They were tasting the exception. I went to the fair on the last day with my wife. We walked through the crowds, past the Midway games and the livestock barns, and we bought 2 ears of roasted corn. They were hot and dripping with butter. We stood there and ate them, and I thought about the whole long journey. The hot July day, the confident young man with his charts, the long nights of worry, the beauty of that frosty morning. It all came down to this: a simple ear of corn that wasn't supposed to exist. My father was a quiet man. He never boasted. He never sought credit. He just worked hard and paid attention. He believed the land held secrets, and that if you watched it long enough and with enough respect, it would share them with you. He taught me that the biggest risks are sometimes the ones that look the safest. The risk of never questioning the common wisdom, of never testing a theory, of never trusting that little voice that tells you there might be another way. The calendar tells you the rule. The ground tells you the exception. That 8-acre field taught me that my father was right. It's not about ignoring the rules. It's about knowing your piece of ground so well that you know which rules it follows and which ones it was meant to break. The real wisdom isn't in the almanac or the university bulletin. It's written in the land itself, in the way the snow melts, the way the fog settles, the way the ground holds the warmth of a fading sun. You just have to be patient enough to read it. I still have that notebook from 1968. And every spring, I take it out and read that line. It reminds me to look closer, to question the averages, and to always check the fog line. If you've got your own piece of ground, your own stubborn patch that doesn't play by the rules, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know what secrets it's told you, and subscribe if this meant something to you. There are always more stories to tell.